Thank you. And today we're joined by CEO of Unified 360, Kate Hardiman, and myself, Rachel Worsley, founder of Neurodiversity Media, to discuss the question, which is, what is the diagnosis process for neurodivergent conditions? So we're talking autism, ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette's, dyscalculia, quite a bunch of different conditions, I suppose. And it's a very common question that people ask of us, and we thought we might try and break it down into simple terms today. So, Kate, over to you. What is your take on this question?
Thank you, Rachel. This is another huge one. Gee, we handle the big questions here, don't we, Rachel?
Yes, we do.
Um, it's important to start by saying that not everyone wants a diagnosis or at least a formal diagnosis. So some people are happy to identify as neurodivergent and they don't feel they need or want to go down a more formal track. That's a completely legitimate choice. But for those who do, in Australia, the diagnosis process involves quite a number of steps. So I thought I'll break it down into those steps. And the journey really starts with recognizing symptoms that might suggest a neurodivergent condition. So maybe over the course of your life, you've had trouble with social interactions, communication, maybe some repetitive behaviors, or things like what we call sensory sensitivities, which are when people are sensitive to things like light and noise and touch and smell. And say you decide you've got questions you might want answers to. The next step is seeking assessment. So currently in Australia, we're seeing people who are curious about whether or not they might be neurodivergent, considering a couple of options. So the option A is going down the formal diagnosis track. This is right for some people and it involves consulting a healthcare professional. So the first conversation people are going to have will usually be with their GP. And it's good to prepare for that because they'll always ask a lot of questions, things like family history. And the outcome that you're looking for from your GP is a referral to a professional who can assess neurodivergence. It's important to know that not every GP is going to understand the signs of neurodivergence in adults. And it can be even more difficult if you're a woman. I'm hearing this a lot. A woman looking for a diagnosis or someone who's just good at masking or camouflaging their differences. Also, not every psychiatrist or psychologist diagnoses neurodivergent conditions. So your GP should refer you to a specialist who can assess for neurodivergent conditions because it's the GP's job to take you seriously and to listen to your needs and your wants. And if you've had a recommendation for a particular psychiatrist or psychologist from a friend or a colleague or a family member, you can ask your GP to refer you to them. Make sure that you ask for a mental health plan if your GP refers you to a psychologist so that you can get a rebate through Medicare towards some of the costs of seeing a psychologist. You can't use a mental health care plan in the same way if you're referred to a psychiatrist, but you can claim some of the psychiatrist appointment fees through Medicare. And many neurodivergent adults find that getting a diagnosis is helpful and it's validating because you can learn how to work to your strengths and to identify what might be challenging. And it can also give you a sense of relief and control when you realize that you're not just different. Um, Rather, I should say you're not different. You're going to have to edit this, Rach. I'm sorry. I'll leave a space and then come back to the last sentence. It can also give you a sense of relief and control where you realize you're just different and not broken. So option B is not as formal and it involves doing a self-assessment, generally online, and there are quite a few of these available on the internet. Some people are choosing this because they're not interested at that time in a formal diagnosis. They just want to satisfy their curiosity, maybe get some information about how they can better manage the challenges related to their condition. Both of these options have their pros and cons and present some challenges. Did you have any comment on any of that before I go through some of the challenges, Rachel?
Yeah, I suppose I can share just a little bit about my personal story in relation to that whole diagnosis process. Okay, you've really outlined it really well, but in terms of like my journey, I suppose I was, I guess, always had been suspected, I suppose, as being autistic when I was very young. I had very delayed speech. I had behaviors that suggested where I was very much isolating myself. I didn't really play with other children. So there were signs that I was autistic quite young when I was at a young age, but that wasn't really picked up at the time. And this was when I was about 3, 4, 5 years old. When I basically grew up, I struggled a lot with social interactions, picking up cues. I struggle to pick up sarcasm. I still do to this day in workplaces where people make comments and I kind of go say, like, reply in a literal way. And they're like, oh, we actually meant that. And I go, oh, okay. And I feel really bad about it still. So that's always kind of been something that's been present throughout my life. And so interestingly, so I've been diagnosed with autism and ADHD, but I pursued two separate processes to get that. So the first one with ADHD, for example, I actually went to a psychiatrist that specialized in ADHD diagnosis, and I had to wait 3 months to get access to, which actually, in hindsight, is quite a short waiting list compared to some of the stories I've heard of really
Yeah.
long waiting lists. And so I basically had to recount my family history and do a couple of quizzes in terms of identifying my inattentive symptoms and uh, some of my hyperactive symptoms. And I was diagnosed with combined ADHD. And I remember feeling extremely relieved and feeling like there was an answer, but I didn't really get the whole picture because I was also suspecting autism as well. So then I went to a clinical neuropsychologist and to get a diagnosis, and that was quite a very thorough process. Like, she interviewed my parents about my early childhood behaviors, and she put me through quite a few different tests, testing my social reasoning, my verbal abilities, some of the intellectual tests, just to rule out intellectual disability. Uh, and so it was quite a thorough process. It lasted for like 4 or 5 hours. It was very intense, and it costs a lot of money. So I should say the psychiatrist diagnosed with ADHD cost about $500, and the assessment with autism costs about $1,500. So it was massively expensive,
Yeah.
and definitely something that, you would have to bear in mind when seeking a diagnosis, because rates can be expensive. And especially when I went to a clinical neuropsychologist, that's also not exactly covered by Medicare as well. So you also have to bear in mind, yeah, that psychologists, psychiatrists, clinical neuropsychologists could diagnose uh, autism potentially, but I think it's mostly psychiatrists and clinical neuropsychologists that can make that proper diagnosis. But I've heard of psychologists making diagnoses as well. So yeah, so I guess overall, how do I feel about these diagnoses? I think it gave me a real understanding of myself and my traits, my strengths, my challenges. And I felt mostly relieved that I had an answer to those challenges, but also some pride in the strengths that I do have with my hyper focus and my attention to detail in areas of great interest to me. I guess my deep empathy for certain topics, which is why very passionate about neurodiversity in the workplace and trying to help other people achieve that potential in the workplace. So that's really, a summary of my journey, I suppose. Kate, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks for sharing your story, Rachel. It's really powerful. And I'm yet to hear of anyone who's had a diagnosis, a formal diagnosis, say that they regret it. So I think you're echoing that. I would probably add some of the pros and cons, some that you've mentioned. So you mentioned the long waiting periods in terms of getting a formal diagnosis. I'm seeing this a lot. Um, Accessing assessment services can be really difficult because of the long waiting times, especially in the public health system. So I'm hearing it's taking anywhere between 6 and 18 months in Australia at the moment, which is such a long time to wait for an answer when you're looking for one. So I'd be asking your GP or your psychiatrist or psychologist to tell you how long they think it might take, because some people are having to go on waiting lists. A lot of psychologists and psychiatrists are fully booked for a long period of time, and some people are having to go on a cancellation list. But while you're waiting, you might want to consider other less formal assessment tools, and I'll talk about one of those in a minute. Another challenge with formal diagnosis is the financial barrier. So by the time people go through the necessary appointments, as you've highlighted, it can be really expensive. So I'm hearing anywhere between $500 and $2,500 for, you know, for people in 2024. It's a huge financial challenge. Um, and neurodivergent conditions often have overlapping symptoms, which can lead to misdiagnosis or delayed diagnosis. Women in particular are often misdiagnosed with things like anxiety and depression before they're properly diagnosed with their neurodivergent condition. In terms of the challenges around informal assessment, if that's what people decide they want to do, depending on the assessment tool you use, it doesn't allow you to access medication for things like ADHD and OCD. To get access to medication, you need a formal diagnosis. So I've just got some tips on how to mitigate those kinds of challenges. So whether or not you go down the formal or the informal pathway, it's about putting yourself in a position to better understand yourself. So the first thing I'd recommend is for people to educate themselves about neurodiversity. The more you learn about it, the better you'll be able to identify and manage your challenges and leverage your strengths. Look for assessment and support as early as possible, because early intervention can make a big difference in managing symptoms and improving outcomes. And make sure you're trying to look for support networks. There are a lot of these out there now, particularly online, where you can share your experiences and ask questions and find resources that are going to help you on the journey. I'd also suggest weighing up the pros and cons of formal diagnosis versus an informal assessment in terms of what's right for you right now. Do you want or need to go the whole way up front through the medical pathway? Or are you just looking to understand yourself more and not necessarily looking for treatment options at this stage? I'd also suggest people get a second opinion. If they're not sure about diagnosis or don't feel their concerns have been addressed properly, or you just feel a bit funny about the diagnosis that you've received, listen to that. There have been a lot of cases where it was only the second opinion that uncovered the existence of a neurodivergent condition. And have a look at the different ways that you might be able to fund a diagnosis or an assessment. As I mentioned earlier, formal assessment can cost anywhere between $500 and $2,500, according to what I'm hearing, depending on who you see and whether you go public or private. Assessments, on the other hand, can range in price from completely free, because they're things you can just Google, to being $300 or $400, and the price depends a lot on how the assessment has been developed, who's developed it, how extensive it is, and the access that you get to additional information and resources and or coaching that they might come packaged with. For example, my organisation, Unified 360, uses the neurodiversity profiler for our clients, and that's a tool developed by Professor Amanda Kirby. She's from the UK. It's evidence-based. Amanda is formerly a GP, and has lived experience of neurodivergence. And people do their assessment online. They get a really comprehensive report which tells them which neurodivergent conditions are, they're likely to have. And they get access to supporting information for 12 months after doing the report to help them sort of navigate from there, I guess. So hopefully some of those tips are going to help people navigate the process.
Thank you, Kate. I appreciate that. And that's a wrap for this episode. So thanks, Kate, for your input, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Rachel.